Hello, hi everyone again. Thanks for joining the CBIA protocol parameters discussion. We have a number of people already on the call. Hi to Santiago, Marvin. On screen already, I have some agenda outline that we put together. But as you know, the main goal of the call is to create a space for discussing this topic. The core part is literally just a presentation by Rick and by Pi, and that we can have an open discussion on the topic. So the very first point, I would like to invite everyone to just give us a one-liner on who they are, starting with myself. My name is Lucas. I collaborate with Maestro, and I've been with the CBIA since inception. Anyone else?
Hi, I'm Pi. I am the CTO at Sunday Labs, and am kind of one of the real-world users, quote unquote, that is greatly impacted by protocol parameter change decisions.
Hi, my name's Rick. I'm a stake pool operator and former podcaster and general Cardano fan.
Hi, I'm Arno, and an architect at IOG, working on Hydra, Mithril, and now Veras.
I am Christina Giannalone. I am COO of Blink Labs, and I work with Pedro on CBIA.
Okay, I can go next. I'm Santiago from TXPipe, software developer.
Hi, I'm Marvin, CEO of Maestro and one of the founding team of the CBIA.
Okay, just taking a look at the room. Anyone else?
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm the CEO of Blink Labs and one of the founders of CBIA.
Hello, I'm Simon. I'm co-founder of Cardano of the Dark and also long-term Catalyst and Cardano community member.
Welcome.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sebastian. I came from Gimba Labs and the Andame team. Glad to be here. Thank you.
I think that's a nice intro for everyone. So I'm just going to go back to sharing my screen. I was just not sharing for us to see each other a bit better. So very, very briefly, I want to point out that this call has been promoted by CBIA. And in a nutshell, CBIA is an alliance between a number of infrastructure players in Cardano. The main goal is to collaborate to find opportunities and challenges and to tackle them or to collaborate on them. I invite you to take a look at our website, cbia.io, and the founding members and joining members are represented here. Many of them, or quite the vast majority is on the call today. And also the goal is to, like I said, share our views on things so that we can also articulate with the founding entities of Cardano and now with Intersect as well. By the way, Christina was asking me, I want to point out that we are recording the call through the assistant and we'll be publishing it to the YouTube. Okay, any questions so far? So with that said, let's jump into the main part of the call, or the sort of introduction, so that we can then start discussing it. This is not in a specific order, so I would invite either Pi or Richard to jump in and introduce their proposal. I have them on screen as well, so I can jump to them if necessary.
Okay, yeah, I don't mind going first because mine's probably shorter and easier, and Pi's is a little more complex and detailed. Is that okay, Pi? For my proposal, I'm suggesting an increase in block size, but more importantly, it's not imminent. It's not required right away. I think what is more important is we need to understand what is the maximum block size we can achieve with Cardano without decreasing throughput, like so that we have increasing throughput, and without creating more height battles and block propagation delay to where the height battles become a problem. Because if there's too many, then it will decrease throughput. And the problem that I'm having trouble wrapping my head around is I don't know how high we can set the block size. And the reason for putting this out now, while it's still early, we still have time to figure this out, right? We still got, it's not urgent, is there's going to be another bull run. And currently, the chain load has about 1.2 million transactions per epoch. And in the last bull run, it hit 4.2 million transactions per epoch. And that was without smart contracts. That was without dApps and utility on Cardano. So that last bull run was just transactions between users and wallets and the exchanges and the exchange to exchange. So there really wasn't a lot of interesting activities to do except, slip ADA around and trade and all that kind of stuff, right? But now the transactions are a lot more complicated, and there's a lot more things to do. So the current transaction load really represents your diehard Cardano users that are still trading on the DEXs and buying NFTs and buying FTs and all that and those kind of activities. That's what the current chain load really is. But during a bull run, you have an increased load where people are manually arbitraging between exchanges and new users are coming on board and all that kind of stuff. So I just want to make sure we have a good understanding of how large can we make the blocks without harming the throughput of the chain and without causing height battles to destroy too many blocks that should be on chain but end up getting kicked out because they got in a height battle. So what I'm suggesting here is if we increase, so if we monitor closely, currently block size at 90 kilobytes, we can probably double it is my best guess. That's the best I got because the current average block propagation delay is about 460 milliseconds, but you don't want it to go to 1,000 milliseconds. That's going to be a problem. If you double the block size, that doesn't mean it will double the propagation time. If you double the block size right now, that'll put us at about 900 milliseconds if you have a full block. You can probably see there's some more data in the link down below. I have questions. If you go all the way to the bottom, I have the link to the actual write-up that I submitted to the change committee. Yeah, it's like second from the bottom, just above that little graph. And so if you want to look it up there. So we got to have a good understanding of how big can we make the block size. My suggestion there is go from under current chain load, we have data on, I don't have a ton of data myself personally. I use Pool Tool and C Explorer to figure out when are we on heavy load, right? When Pool PM. And I look at that data and then do a small and incremental increases, wait a period of time, see how well the chain responds. The best data points I can look at are when there's like a heavy NFT drop that people are really interested. So you got people hitting the network from all over the world. Sometimes the limitation is the dApp. Like if there's an FT launch on MinSwap, sometimes the chain is the limitation, but sometimes the dApp and the batchers or something else. There's something else is the limitation. And there was a couple times where there was heavy NFT drops going on where I would see the chain load on Pool PM go to about 90 to 92%. And it's mostly due to one specific dApp and one specific NFT or FT drop. But what I've done is I went and used something else and I found that around 90 to 92%, there's a little bit of lag in user experience. It might go 2 or 3 blocks before the transaction goes through. which isn't bad. That's pretty tolerable by most users. But if we start to do 4x the transaction load, even though it's brief spurts that it spanned from like epoch 3.0, it spans a period of a month, and then it sustains at around 2 million for a couple of epochs, spikes up to 4 million, dips back down to 1 million. So if you combine the user activity on chain and the user activity between the exchanges and the centralized exchanges next bull run, there's going to be a lot of activity overlapping, and we might find that we hit this maximum throughput very quickly, because when the bull runs kick in, it ramps up very quick. And so we might want to have a plan to say, yeah, we can, we know we can increase it to 120, or we know we can increase it to 140 if we need to. That way, you're not deterring the user. So I just wanted to kick this conversation off early on. And also, if anyone has more data, if anybody actually knows what max block size can we actually hit given the current Plutus V1, V2, and the current L1 conditions, I'd be happy to hear that. But if you got any questions, let me know. That's all I had to add. Anybody got questions for me?
I think Pedro wanted to save the questions for after both of you guys had a chance to share your proposals. And I'm sure we'll have some questions.
Okay, yeah. All right, cool.
Yeah, I had some comments. They're not really questions, but just like extra context. I think it would be helpful for people if for Rick's proposal in particular, if that would be okay.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. So, Rick, I think you mentioned that the average block propagation delay is around 400 milliseconds, and we don't want that to exceed 1 second, 1,000 milliseconds. And I think the average is a lot less important here than something like the 95th percentile. I don't remember the exact metrics that IOG uses, but it's something along the lines of, we should see block propagation below 1,000 milliseconds in 95% of blocks. So looking at the average there can be potentially misleading. Another piece of really good context here is that changing the maximum block size and changing the maximum transaction size have very different risk profiles. Because if we increase the maximum transaction size, we can essentially never decrease it. Because in that gap, there could be somebody who created, they locked up their NFTs in some DApp or something that got deployed that now depends on that size, like being able to have an 18 or a 20 kilobyte transaction in order to spend those funds. And so if we increase it, someone gets into that situation, and then we decrease it, we will lock their funds. The same is not true of blocks. We could increase the block size and then decrease it if it's causing issues. So that's another thing for people to keep in mind is increasing the transaction limits is always really risky because it's basically not a reversible operation. Whereas increasing block limits is a much safer operation because, in the worst case scenario where it does start causing problems, we can roll that back without risking locking anybody's funds. Obviously, we won't, we'll lose that benefit of the increase, and maybe that causes some pain, but we won't, lock anybody's funds because of that limit change.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So that said, maybe let's have the presentation by Pi. I have that proposal on screen as well. And go ahead, Pi.
Sure. Yeah, so my proposal is in a similar vein of, we know that there's a lot of activity coming and we want to be prepared for it. And so we want to start the process of either analyzing these changes or deploying them to see kind of what is impacted and then and stuff like that. However, from my perspective, the block size is basically not really a concern. I think it'd be nice to increase it for, some of those really peak loads, but I think we have two things that are going to largely obviate the need for that. First, there's a SIP being implemented in the Conway hard fork, one that I wrote, that is going to allow Plutus v1 scripts to be satisfied by script reference inputs, which will basically free up 40% of the blockchain more or less instantly. It requires the dApps to actually start using that, but it's a really simple change. So I expect that to happen pretty fast. And two, like if we look at the outcomes when the block or when the chain is at capacity under different, when it's throughput by different parameters or limited by different parameters, the effects of us hitting the maximum block size are, okay, maybe the user, when they submit their transaction, it doesn't get confirmed in the very next block. They have to wait, a block or two because, they have to make it through that back pressure queue. And I think that frustrates people a lot less than conversely when we're bottlenecked by memory units. And when we're bottlenecked by memory units, it means the dApps can't do enough work to keep up with user demands. And with that, we see a lot more aggressive queue times, right? So whereas fitting like a person-to-person transfer into a block is relatively easy and, a few blocks of delay isn't a big deal, trying to do a swap on a DEX and having to wait 3 hours frustrates users a lot more than us hitting the max block size limits. And so I would make the case that it is much more important that we raise the execution unit limits than the block size. Now, in terms of looking at which execution units to increase, Smog and to a much lesser extent myself did a lot of analysis on what are we currently bottlenecked by. And it looks like the way that the limits are set, or the way that the budgets are set for execution units, we use, typically most dApps use 2 memory, like 2 basis points of memory for every basis point of CPU. And what I mean is basically we hit our memory capacity with about 50% capacity left on CPU units. And what that tells me is that, we could we could basically double the memory units before we were fully utilizing the step limits of the blockchain. Now that means one of two things. Either the memory units are not right-sized for the payloads that we have and can be increased, or the step units are not right-sized for the safety of the blockchain. Because, theoretically, if we increase the memory limit to the point where it kind of goes toe-to-toe with CPU limits, so that like basically every full transaction is using 100% of its CPU and memory, whereas right now it's 100% of its memory and 50% of its CPU. If we were to increase the memory units, we would see more steps get used, which might increase the time that it takes to adopt a block. But if that is a problem, then it's already a problem today because somebody could submit a transaction that doesn't use a lot of memory and just does a lot of CPU and burn those cycles. And if that can impact propagation delay, then we're vulnerable to that now. But looking at, the good news, I think, is that with the help of Marcus and a bunch of other people in the community, when we look at historical data of, not just block propagation times, but, how is that broken down granularly, it looks like the vast majority of time is spent downloading the block, i.e. propagating it from node to node, and a very, very small amount of the time is devoted to adopting that block. So actually running the scripts and allocating the memory and things like that. So I think we can pretty safely increase the memory unit limits up to the point where they're kind of more in line with the CPU step limits without dramatically increasing block propagation times, even if we're under kind of austere conditions like the 99th percentile or the 95th percentile. And I think that that would have a much more dramatic improvement on the user experience of using dApps on the chain under times of intense load than increasing the block limit or the block size would be. That being said, they're not mutually exclusive. So if there's evidence that we can do both, I think that's great. I just think that like if we have to choose one, the memory units gets us a lot further in alleviating the user experience concerns that come up during periods of high load.
Yeah, and that's why I had raised my hand. I wanted to clarify that these are two separate things, although they affect each other, for two completely separate reasons. And it's kind of like you gave a contrast of one or the other, but I wanted to clarify it's not one or the other.
Sure.
Two totally different things for a completely different purpose.
Yeah, I framed it a lot
clear.
in terms of comparing them, just because I think it helps frame it. But yeah, Rick is absolutely right. They are separate proposals. They can be adopted separately. They may have impacts on each other, so we should consider carefully how that is. But when it boils down to which one is maybe more urgent or would have the greatest impact, I am just making the case that I think memory units, if we had to choose, would be the more impactful one.
I concur.
Okay, great stuff. Santiago?
Yeah, is it time for questions already?
Yeah, well, we've had some sort of talk back between Rick and Pi, but let's go ahead and open the floor for anyone to jump in with questions. That's what we're here for, yeah.
Okay, for Pi mainly, but does increasing the memory budget have a similar risk profile as the transaction size increase, in the sense that we can go one way, but if we try to go back, we would be blocked? That's question one. And then question two, you mentioned that there is this kind of ratio between steps and memory units. Is this ratio shared across the board in all of the, or around roughly the same ratio in all of the apps that we see currently on chain? That's an interesting finding.
Yeah, so Smog did a bunch of analysis by kind of correlating that data. If you go over to the forum that or the post, I think I include that. If you yeah, so here, basically, if you look at this data, basically, yes, almost every dApp is about 50% constrained by memory. And so, there's exceptions, obviously, and it's not as clean as like in every single case, because there's even some dApps that just hard code the max limit for either one. And so they're just like a really heavy point in the top right corner. But if you look at the typical use case, I think if you scroll down a bit, one of these charts makes it really clear. Block size, block memory units. So scroll down. There's one of them that maybe it's in the Twitter thread, but essentially somewhere in the data, it shows that if something is at its maximum execution units, then it's at 50%, or maximum memory units, it's at 50% of its CPU. And while other people are answering questions, I'll look for the exact chart that I'm thinking of. But and there's like a pretty clear linear curve in the data.
Interesting. And regarding the risk profile that you mentioned for transaction size, does that apply also for memory units? Can we go back if we attempt an increase without locking.
At the block level, yeah, right? Because the block level is just how many transactions can you fit in.
No, I mean,
now, obviously, if we were in a situation where we decreased the block size below the transaction size, then we have some issues. But
no,
yeah,
but I mean for memory units, if we increase memory units, is it safe to go back without the risk of locking any?
Again, at the block level, yes, that's true for all of the different sizing parameters: block size, memory, step, etc. From the transaction size, it's never safe.
Okay, size and memory units and step units.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I found it. Can I share my screen?
I think so. Give it a shot. Yep.
So this chart by Smog makes it really clear, where there's this like very strong linear trend where we push up to around 50, maybe even a little less, where by the time we hit 100% memory units, we're nowhere near 50% execution steps. So basically, if we doubled the memory units, this linear trend would continue, and we'd be up. We'd hit 100% execution units at around the same time that we hit 100% memory units.
Did you find who is the dot on the top right corner?
Yeah, I think it was ADAX. So somebody basically got too frustrated with calculating the the actual budget, because it was like there across most implementations there's subtle bugs that make it different, so you always have to like add some padding or whatever, and so they just hard-coded it to the maximum, I think.
Guys, Arnaud was just saying he needs to drop off. Do you want to say anything to share with the group, Arnaud? I think he's off.
Okay.
Okay. Cheers. Sorry. Any follow-up thoughts to this?
Have you received any strong feedback in favor or opposing these changes? The IOC team mainly, but
no. The Michael Peyton Jones weighed in on and said that the only kind of thing to be concerned about is even if increasing memory is even if memory is way below what the nodes could handle, right? Because like we're talking 14 megabytes per transaction. It's something that's super easy to like arena allocate and just drop at the end of the transaction. Like the memory likely shouldn't be a big bottleneck when we have 24 gigs in the resident set size from the UTXO. 14 megabytes isn't going to make or break anything, even if we like double or triple that. His only concern was that increasing the memory units is likely going to correlate with the CPU units, and so we'll be doing more CPU work as well. And if he makes the same point that I did, where if the parameters are right sized for kind of the safety of the blockchain, that shouldn't matter. But if they're not, then it's going to kind of impact the propagation times of people in remote locations and things like that. Ultimately, I've been convinced that it's not a concern, because the time to adopt a block is never the dominant factor. It's almost universally across thousands and thousands and thousands of blocks worth of data. It's 80% of the time is spent actually downloading the bytes of the block, and then 20% or less of the time is spent adopting it and advancing your chain tip with that new block.
And on the block size side, Rick, did you receive any feedback?
Yeah, I got feedback from Terminator and another user. There's concerns from people who are geographically remote with the propagation time. So I think what's happening is, and I call them the outliers. So on outlier nodes where they have a slow connection, or they're using Starlink because Starlink is inherently slower than fiber, right? Laws of physics apply. They end up, the blocks have a little bit more propagation time due to network connectivity. So that is important to make note of. But I based the information that I posted on the average network block size. And I don't think it's a good idea to use the slowest possible node to determine the maximum possible block size. I think it's a pretty good idea to shoot for the network average. Now, I did make note that, you know, you'll end up having the nodes coalesce into big data centers in the USA and in Germany or in Europe, in order to decrease the distance between the nodes, which is fair enough. It makes sense. It happened on Jormungandr testnet because it didn't have the VRF checks. So we did see that problem before on testnet. And there's other blockchain protocols that have that problem where they're coalescing into the big data centers. So that does need to be taken into consideration, that there are remote nodes being operated in, there's Australia and stuff like that. But I've done speed checks, round trip ping time between Eastern USA and Australia, which is about 12,000 miles apart, opposite sides of the planet, is still about 240 millisecond round trip ping time, 240 milliseconds. So that's less impactful. As Pi indicated earlier, 80% of the time is the remote node downloading the block from the originator, from the origin of the block, right? So on these 460 millisecond blocks, the fastest blocks I'll see at about 140 milliseconds. The average is 400 and some milliseconds. And the slow average, if you will, the slow percentile is, you know, in the 700 to 800 milliseconds. There are outliers that exceed 1 second. So 1 second out of 20 seconds is 95%, and you want 95% of the blocks received in under 1 second. That way you minimize the height battles and stay within the slot battle, you know, protocol constraints, and you're not diminishing the throughput. Yeah, so that was a good question. Did I answer it correct? Is that good, or you need more information?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to know if there was any.
I don't have precision data like Pi has from Smog, but now that I look at it, I think maybe we can get Smog to analyze some block size versus time and do another heat graph like he had shown there. And
yeah, he actually
maybe it'll help us calculate.
In the same tweets, he's got all of the different parameters kind of correlated against each other.
Okay, good. That's good data to have. We still need to figure out what that max block size is, though. So when the time comes, we got to pull the trigger. We got to pull the trigger. It's going to happen.
Yeah, and
we should know what that number is.
Does IoT have any kind of network simulation software that maybe can be used to try out different settings? I imagine that would be something interesting to have
as far as I've been able to tell, they do not. They do have a benchmarking suite, but it's not well documented. I don't think anybody's been able to replicate it, you know, externally. And from what I've heard, basically the way that they set the execution unit limits is they say, okay, we're going to run these benchmarks on a quote unquote typical machine, which is, I think, one of the engineer's laptops, and measure and try to set the budget for each operation, each kind of built-in or operation that you can have in UPLC to be, measure the time it takes to execute that in picoseconds. So I, as far as I know, there's not been any good concerted effort to reproduce those results outside of IOG.
Cautious Chris has had his hand up, and do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just a couple quick ones. So on the Pi, for the memory execution units, what do you think would be the easiest and most impactful? Increasing the transaction memory units or the block memory unit?
I think that it's probably indistinguishable in the sense that most dApps these days, Sunday Swap is an exception. We haven't gotten around to implementing it, but most dApps will chain their transactions so that they can execute within the same block anyway. So like what you're going to do if you increase the transaction size limits is you get fancier numbers. Oh, here's a block or a transaction that did 50 swaps instead of 35, for example. But if you don't increase the block limit, then you can still only fit so many blocks or so many transactions of that size. Now you can fit fewer transactions of that size. So like you haven't increased throughput at all. You've just kind of improved the marketing for but like for dApps, so they can say, we can process 20 orders in a batch instead of, or we can process 50 orders instead of 2 times 25, right? So like it's kind of indistinguishable if you just increase the transaction limits. Really, the increasing the block limits is what lets more activity overall happen on the chain. And so, I would probably gear towards either increasing the block or increasing both the block and the transaction limits at the same time.
Right, because I mean, wouldn't increasing the transaction limits require actual potentially changes on the dApps versus the block would just everyone would magically benefit?
No, I mean not necessarily, right? Because the way that most dApps work is, and I mean I can't necessarily say this for true, but because the amount of orders that you can fit within a batch varies anyway based on what that order is doing. You kind of just have to step it up until you get the biggest transaction you can, right? So what we do is we binary search. We say, okay, can we fit 10 orders? Can we fit 15? Can we fit 12? We kind of walk it up to see what the biggest transaction size we can build is without exceeding our budget. And then once we get that, we just submit it to the blockchain. And so, if you increase that limit, dApps are basically going to automatically take advantage of that increased space within the transaction. And so, especially in dApps, so there are a few dApps that would benefit from more composability from a user experience standpoint. So JPEG Store, for example, when you do I want to mass purchase and do a floor sweep, their limit of how many transactions or how many NFTs you can buy in a single transaction, that's directly exposed to the user because they have to, if the limit is 50 and they want to buy 100 NFTs, they have to sign 2 different transactions. So if you increase that, you immediately increase the user experience. For something like a DEX, because it's this 2-stage order, basically doesn't make a difference. For something like Butane, which is launching soon, that allows you to mint different synthetic positions, you could fit more within that transaction or compose those operations with other protocols better. So, there is some benefit in increasing the transaction size. So it's either increase the block or increase both the block and the transaction, in my opinion. And I think that actually differs from my original proposal. So when I wrote this up, I didn't necessarily have that much nuance and understanding. So I think that's a different stance than when I originally created this proposal.
Rick?
Yeah, Pi, do you know if that will help with contention? For example, the most painful user experience I ever had with a dApp is Indigo, and it doesn't mean it's Indigo's fault, but it was contention where all the users were hitting it at the same time around June 10th to June 12th, 2023. I remember that time frame very clearly because it'll liquidate, right? And so, yeah, there's a lot of users that remember those days very clearly. So I don't know if you don't have to answer that. That's really not yours to answer. But do you think it could help reduce contention?
Basically, no. But there are kind of 2 things to consider there, right? So there's one, contention issues on based on Indigo's design only come up when you're opening a new CDP, because then you have to, or depositing into a stability pool. When you're updating an existing CDP, that's not actually a contention issue. And the kind of the user experience there, I think, came from overloading their Ogmios servers. And so basically the answer is in both cases, no, increasing these limits doesn't help with contention or with, the Ogmios server scalability. So yeah.
Thank you.
Just curious if anyone has looked at the two of these kind of together in a sense of, if we double the block size but don't touch the memory execution units, like do we actually get twice as many DApp, transactions within a block, or do we start hitting those limits first? Right? Like, do we?
Well, that's already the case. We're already hitting the max block memory unit limits well before, like we can fit I think four Sunday swap scoops within a block before we hit the memory units. And let's ignore the Plutus script size because that also has a big impact on it. But like if you remove the Plutus v1 scripts with SIP 110, or you look at a Plutus v2 that's using reference scripts, we're going to use like less than 20% of the block size. Really, the block size helps when you are like you have a lot of people sending funds back and forth with really complicated UTXOs. So like, oh, I have 100 NFTs, and so I need to like my transaction is going to be much bigger because all of those NFTs appear in the outputs as change. Or when you're minting new NFTs, because like especially with SIP 68, you're putting the like whole metadata of the NFT into the transaction, and so I really think it, because especially if you look at those load graphs, we're never at a really sustained 98% load, right? We'll see spikes that jump up to 99% and then they'll drop down to like 50%. So we have a lot of spare capacity, and so when we experience those periods of load, the total effect is like, okay, maybe it waits a block or two before there's space, and then we can fit those extra bytes into that block. But from a DApp perspective, we're really throughput limited by the memory because we can only, for Sunday swap, we can process 2 to 4 orders per batch and 4 batches per block. And, that's not using up the max memory unit. So being able to kind of fill that in, I think would be a lot more impactful to the user experience, like I was saying.
Rick, go ahead, please.
Yeah, Pi, I wanted to add to that and follow up with what you're saying there. You know how the FIFO buffer works? And let's say there's a block about to be made. We don't know when or where, but the block is about to be made, right? And let's say as the transactions are coming in, the memory units are full. Let's say the memory units are 100% full, but the block size is only 50% full. So there's still actually room in there. Doesn't that back pressure cause regular ADA transactions that are much smaller? They can't fill in that little gap because of it's FIFO. So they still got to wait in line until that block takes off, and then they'll go into the next block.
So actually not sure if the mempool, I know the mempool is at least mostly FIFO, but I think there's a world in which either currently or with a pretty easy change, we could do a fairly greedy algorithm to say, okay, we're going to include until the execution units are limited, and then we're going to go over the rest of the mempool and include anything that has 0 execution units, right? So just simple transfers or NFT metadata and things like that. So I think it would be pretty. It either already is the case that it just continues scanning over the blocks in the mempool. It doesn't do multipass, it doesn't do bin packing, but I do think there's a good chance it scans over things and just includes each transaction if it's able, meaning it will, if there is a few things that eat up all the execution units, and then a bunch of transactions that don't require any execution units, it will fit those in. And if that's not the case, then that's a really easy change for us to make in the node to kind of fill that in pretty easily.
Yeah, my current understanding is that is not the case. If it's FIFO, because it's sitting on the relay says, here's my next transaction. You can have the next one, FIFO only, until that block producer gets it. And so my understanding is there's going to be a gap in there.
That'll be how it works in terms of filling up the mempool, right? So like the block producer will say, hey, I have space in my mempool. I'm going to ask for the next transaction from the relay and then insert it into the mempool. But the mempool is only sized based on bytes, right? So it's usually set to 2 times the limit of a block. So the block producer will fill up its mempool with 160 kilobytes worth of transactions, and then when it comes time for it to produce a block, it will start at the top of that mempool and start just including transactions as until it can. So then the question is, does it stop on the first time it fails to include a transaction, or does it do a single sweep? I know it doesn't do bin packing. It doesn't try to optimize and absolutely maximize all 3 parameters. But I think it's possible that in that first sweep, so long as it can keep fitting things, it will keep continuing to fit things, and it doesn't just fail the first time it can't include a transaction. And so my bet would be that's how it works. But again, I don't know for sure. So that would be a really good thing for somebody to research and confirm, and then potentially propose a change to the implementation that does that. Again, bin packing is NP hard. We're not going to be able to get maximally efficient transactions, but something very simple like a linear scan that just keeps filling until it can't fill or until it reaches the end of the mempool, rather than stopping on the first failure, would be super easy for us to do and would help a lot there.
Thank you.
Any more questions from anyone? Thoughts, views?
No, just thanks a lot. This was a really nice conversation, and I'm really glad. Thank you.
I'm really glad to be able to have it. It's a kind of thing that there hasn't existed a formalism for talking about this stuff for a long time. So
Very good.
I like you out into the void.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation, guys. My only thought is that I think that we don't have the required tools to strictly analyze these changes up front. So that is something lacking at the ecosystem level. But the importance of these changes and how impactful they are is not aligned with the level of investment in the tools to simulate and analyze changes.
Yeah. One interesting idea that kind of got I kicked out at I think it was yesterday, it'd be really cool if we had a way to say 1% of all produced blocks can be subject to a different limit. And that way we could basically do canary testing where we could say, okay, and Rick, I actually worked with Marcus a lot on kind of producing this data. But we could do canary testing where we say, okay, 1% of blocks are allowed to use double the limit. And that's, not going to impact our security parameters because, 1% of blocks propagating slower is not a big deal. But it would allow us to say, okay, let's let that run for a couple of weeks and then look at just the 1% of blocks. What is the property of just that population, and judge if that's safe for us to upgrade.
Or maybe one day in the epoch.
Right. I mean, that'd be 20% of blocks. So
the purge.
Preferably during a degenerate NFT drop or FT drop, so that there's an ultra heavy chain load when it's happening.
Richard was saying in the chat that Marcus Gufler might have more data.
Yeah, and he's one of the people that I worked with a lot to kind of develop the conclusions that I have. We called it Project Plumpy, but we got a bunch of people together to look at, how do we make the blockchain really fat and plumpy?
Fill it up.
Okay. Yeah, we had just had Sebastian Nigel joining. Thank you for joining. We'll be releasing this on YouTube in a few hours, hopefully. I'm not sure if we have any more questions for today. That was actually my last point, to just say that feel free to review the call. We're going to share the links in the description of that video. And yeah, get in touch with CBIA, follow us, or apply as a member. One thing I neglected to mention on the introduction is that we have started infrastructure work group inside Intersect. That hasn't really been picking up that much, to be honest, but we're looking forward to continue the discussion we have here, there, and have things flowing a bit between the spaces, because Intersect is a lot broader, and the mission of CBIA is to create a bit of focus on these kinds of topics that are infrastructure related. Okay.
Oh.
So if that's all, thank you so much, and I'll see you on the next call from CBIA.
Yeah, thanks for
Thanks,
the
guys.
invite.
Bye, Rick. Thank
Okay,
you.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
There it is. Okay.